Thank you for coming today. If this is your first day, this won't be review. If it's your second day, don't snore too loud and just remember to wake up when we have the real highlight for today. For the boring stuff, how to get out here. I'm actually surprised because there's emergency exit right out here, but I don't know where that goes. Maybe this is a follow directions. If you go there, you get trapped and you burn and die. As opposed to making either a left or a right. If you make a right, make another right, you'll be at the end. Make a left about halfway down, there's the fire exit there. Uh, again, welcome. Your clowns for the day, your host for the day. I'm Eric Berger, General Chair of DySPAN.
Good morning, and I'm Nick Lanneman, General Chair of Spectrum Week.
And we're not going to bore you with what you're doing here because you're here. So thank you all very much. Speaking of thank yous.
Yeah, so as you can probably see from the agenda, this is a pretty complicated set of events that we've put together this week. And so we want to acknowledge the folks that helped us organize it. So this is the organizing committee for NSF Spectrum Week. Thank you all.
And the thing that amazes me with 5 times the number of things going on, because you got a whole bunch of different things all together for Spectrum Week, we only have DySPAN, but we also have like twice as many people on our organizing committee. You will actually notice a number of pictures that are the same people because we really worked really hard to coordinate the schedules, coordinate the content, and make it really interesting for both communities. So a big thank you to the various DySPAN people. So while we're on DySPAN, we're going to do the TPC report. You remember? No, just joking. That was yesterday. If you want to see the stats and all that, then we've got them for you. But we were a competitive conference, not a highly competitive conference this year. Again, that was kind of by design with the reboot. A few people have asked me. Yes, we do have Best Paper awards, which will be announced tonight at the banquet.
All right, so again, some important points that all the keynotes and panels are joint and open to everyone that's registered either for DySPAN or Spectrum Week or both. Most of the keynotes and panels are in this space, so this is our biggest space. We also have an overflow room next door, just like going to church in case it's a big enough event, you can step next door and watch it on the big screen. Everything is being recorded and we'll be posting them over time.
And of course, when we say everything, we mean everything that's NSF Spectrum Week and anything that's joint. The DySPAN technical presentations, all that, are not, but actually new news. All of the paid attendees do get, of course, all the papers, not just an IEEE Explorer, but you'll get a link to them. You will also get a link for those authors who choose to their slides. So that's also kind of a pitch to the authors. In fact, if you didn't see that email, let us know. You should have gotten an email from me asking you to upload your presentation if you care to. Again, thanks to our DySPAN sponsors, the National Spectrum Consortium, for a huge gift support for this conference, as well as Viavi. If you weren't here Monday night, you missed the open bar. And of course, thanks to our other sponsors and of course the NSF. How many people here are on NSF student travel? All right, yeah, you have to be here because otherwise you don't get the money. So thank you for being here, enjoy it. It wouldn't be a conference, actually it would be, because Spectrum Week is not doing what DySPAN is doing, which is, oops, this is the first time I've been in a situation where the printed schedule was correct and the online up-to-date, can do all this stuff was wrong. So online is now all correct. But like if you took your where are you going to be for today and tomorrow for the technical sessions, if it says Washington 3, it really means Monroe. Again, the printed schedule was correct, so if you're going off the printed schedule, you're fine. If you're going off of the website today, it's correct. But just want to let you know about that. The other thing is we will get to the other change. We did the slides in the wrong order, but that's actually all right. The beauty of electronics. Who cares what the slides are? Tutorials on tomorrow, Thursday, have been shifted around a little bit. Again, this is correct online, but the printed ones are going to be a little bit out of date. The two in bold, coexistence and spectrum sharing, has been moved to the morning, and machine learning for security and machine learning and security for machine learning for spectrum operations has been moved up just a little bit, and the room assignments may have moved around. But all the morning technical sessions are correct on the website. And again, this is on the website in the printed schedule.
All right, so again, given the complexity, we thought we would give you a couple of highlights for the day. So starting with Spectrum Week, we're in day 2 of the SpectrumX Center meeting. So we'll be focusing this morning on flagship projects, which is a new initiative. We'll have a joint panel on the broadband digital divide. In the afternoon, we'll focus on collaboration, and we're going to have the first Spectrum Week career fair. So if you are interested in careers, we have a resume book for you. If you're interested in talent, we have tables for you. So please check that out.
And in DySPAN, we also have a continuation of our technical program and the joint section on the broadband digital divide. And then in the evening, the DySPAN banquet. So please be there for that. You also may have noticed in the corner, Washington 1, are demos and posters for DySPAN, but that's open for all and right next to the coffee. So feel free to bring your coffee. Please don't spill it into any of the demos, though, although that would be a good test of the resiliency of our demos. And then last but not least, we did the tutorial. So with that, we're up to our keynote. I'd like to ask Simon Saunders to introduce our keynoter, Dave Willis from OfCom.
Pleasure. Thank you, Eric. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, I've been on the TPC looking after the policy track of the event, but also sort of standing up for the international nature of DySPAN. As you can probably tell, I'm not from the US. But by way of introduction to David, I did want to say a few things about the importance of getting an international perspective on this. I mean, I'm quite happy to say as a Brit that I think the US is in the lead on spectrum sharing initiatives. I think that's objectively true. But I think it's really important that we do get a full international viewpoint. We want DySPAN to be the premier global conference for spectrum innovation, and I think the reboot has achieved the premier conference bit, but I'd say we still have a way to go on the global and international piece. So we need to do that. We need to do it because we need to build economies of scale in this stuff. It's no good, having manufacturers build kit with special stuff for special countries. We need that sort of global benefit. We need to harmonize and standardize approaches to spectrum sharing to benefit from that experience. We need to understand the very different context in different places. I can see in some of the presentations here, that there are sort of built-in assumptions that you don't know you're making about the context and the expectations. And we can benefit from great ideas around the world. So here's an example. What about the idea of not having exclusive spectrum licenses at all? Does that sound crazy? Well, it turns out it's actually the case in the UK. And I can think of nobody better to give that context than David Willis. David is the Group Director for Spectrum at OfCom, my former employer, and the UK's independent communications regulator. Decoding that, he is the UK's head honcho for Spectrum, bar none. He's a relatively recent import, coming up for a couple of years, I think, David, from Canada, where he was president of the Communications Research Centre out there. He previously led the spectrum engineering team at the Innovation, Science and Economic Development in Canada, and he led the Canadian delegation for the 2019 WRC. He's also a veteran of some really long lamented Canadian companies in the form of both BlackBerry and Nortel. So with that, David, I'm delighted you could make it here. We're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
We start with a fancy title. I'm not sure whether we're going to fulfill the goal of the fancy title, and recognizing that we had a mixed audience between DySPAN and SpectrumX, Spectrum NSF. We're going to start with maybe some early, there we are. So start with some OfCom and UK context, just give you a little bit of an overview for those of you that might be less familiar with our regulatory. Some of the perspectives we have on spectrum sharing and coexistence, and some of the work, and do it mostly through active files that we're working on, and stuff we've learned through stuff historically. So if I go to OfCom, so OfCom's the converged communications regulator for the UK. Making communications work for everyone is a big theme. It's got the telecom regulator, the spectrum regulator, broadcast and content regulator, and the newest thing we've got now is a fairly significant investment in an online safety regulator, particularly focused on protection of children. And so we've got about 1,500 people in total that work at the regulator. It is a fully independent entity from government. The UK does like independent regulation, big P policy set in government, independent implementation to try and get sort of a longer term and a bit more independence on some of the implementation details. Works fairly well. From a spectrum regulator perspective, we are a soup to nuts organization, so we do everything from the international work. We're delegated by the government to represent the UK at WRCs and other international standards fora, all the way through sort of smaller P policy, regulatory authorization frameworks, awards, and a full-size field staff. If you look in Europe, there's lots of different models. France splits their field staff and their international work and their standards work into sort of 3 separate entities. Netherlands does something different. Germany actually has their field staff with their regulator and gas entity, right? So they share with whatever they distribute around the country between a mega regulator, I guess, in Germany. So it's interesting. Our relationship with government is, I guess, somewhere between what Canada and the US has. We don't have the hard separation of the NTIA, but there are Crown use rights. We collaborate with the Crown and their use. They're pretty free how to use it however they like it, but they recognize that coordinating is a good idea. And there is coordination through a policy unit at the department that Simon's been working with, Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, that coordinates the various government use and then talks to us about policy objectives from the government. So that's sort of the whistle stop of sort of how we're organized. Happy to answer additional questions there. Thought it might be useful to talk about some of our recent work and what does it look like? What's our pipeline? We finished C-band sort of 2018, 2021. And we moved into sort of more recently, we've actually had the recurrence of an older technology. So we did an ELRAN licensing product last year and a drone product. We've been looking at refarming 28 gigahertz more towards satellite activities and away from fixed blocks that are being returned. We've freed up a bunch of stuff around millimeter wave. We haven't yet done our auction, and the ongoing decline in the demand curve continues to be a bit interesting for us. But we do have an auction on tap. That's the transition from the pink to the blue. The blue hasn't all happened yet. 1.4 gigahertz is a 25 megahertz of spectrum that's been sitting there. European mandate that hasn't been broadly released, has some conflicts with some Inmarsat maritime and aero safety related applications that provide some challenges on 1900 megahertz. And this is where it always gets interesting with the mobile industry. This is another 25 megahertz that had got auctioned 20 years ago that we've reclaimed and is now being moved towards railway. No ecosystem really developed for this. It was in a sweet spot, but no European ecosystem developed around 1900 to 1925. It sat there, laid fallow, was being used for a bespoke safety application, which we're confident we can move sort of a little bit upwards and make better use of the spectrum. And railways have landed on 1900 to 1910 for FRMCS, and we're headed down that path. Upper 6 gigahertz is a big conversation, and we'll come back to that. Opening up QV and E bands for satellite. There's been significant acceleration because of the constellations and the demand for gateway capacity. What you get up from all the individual users has got to get back down to a limited number of gateway sites, and has put a lot of demand on future gateways applications. We just had an announcement of a partnership with a UK vendor who does some of the equipment here with Starlink. And then obviously looking forward to WRC 27. So that's Spectrum. On the management framework side, a lot of work on our space framework. UK being smaller, satellites hadn't been a really big emphasis over time. It's picked up. It certainly was there, but it wasn't sort of the same impact that you have in the US and Canada. But lots of work for us on NGSO Earth Station networks, as well as gateways for NGSOs. We've seen massive growth in terms of Starlink deploying in the UK. I think we're in their top 10 markets, and significant growth. And so we've also done gateway applications or Earth Station network applications for 6 different vendors. All of that's public, so Rivada, and a variety of others as well. And we're expecting at least 2 or 3 more vendors. So we probably expect to have seen 9 applications for Earth Station networks for constellations by the end of this year, which is from nothing 2 years ago. We did amateur rule updates, so we went back after 40 years and reopened our amateur rules. It was a really interesting experience. We actually got to use some early AI tools to process the 15,000 responses we got so that we didn't have to read them all and parse them into individual comments. So as a regulator, that was a particularly useful thing for us to be able to do. We're looking, again, spectrum for utilities and railways, particularly with the net zero impetus and the way the electrical networks, it's driving a lot of the capacity out to the edge. How do they do a black start? They're very interested in what are the comms requirements for that? How do they get that off the ground? And how do they do it in a resilient and cost-effective manner? I'm going to talk more about sharing, obviously, so I'll come back to, but shared access licensing, which has been our approach to private networks. I think somebody said CBRS envy yesterday. I'm not quite sure it's that, but we didn't quite have to do all the sensing stuff, so that helped us. But, certainly some of the same applications, and we'll talk about that. And then obviously some of the boring stuff around fees versus deployments versus licensing periods, and lots of work on that sort of stuff. Lots of interest because of the amounts of money involved. So one of the other interesting things is obviously the UK is very different from a connectivity perspective, and I thought it'd be really interesting for people to see that. So on the fixed network side, actually full fiber is a really recent thing. There was some changes 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago about that, to how broadband was deployed. And it's driven from sort of very little fiber passing houses to 60 going on 70% fiber pass in 5 years, right? Triggered a whole bunch of alternative network providers to invest capital, and it's really been a focus over the last 5 years. So going from a market that was still heavily dependent on DSL to one that has significant fiber all over the place, and in a dramatic way. And that really affects your options and how you might deploy your network architectures. 78% gigabit capable, right? Gigabit cable as well. 97% super fast, and less than 1% below 10 megabits per second. Another interesting thing in this market is when we were doing our millimeter wave structure, we looked at around our top 60 cities still aren't 50% of the population. So densely populated, but all over the place. The biggest cities are, London's very big, Liverpool, Manchester are relatively big, and then you've got a massive number of dense, mid-sized, medium-sized cities all over. And even once you've done that, you've got pockets of density all over, which is very different than certainly what I would have seen in Canada previously, but also than you'd see in the US. And that drives differences in the networks. So 95% 4G geographic coverage as a work in progress. So we don't talk about population coverage. We talk about geographic coverage for targets for our mobile networks. That's very different if you think about that, and drives very different behaviors. Population coverage is in excess of 99% outside, not a challenge. It's covering parts of northern Scotland, pockets inside the parts of the country. And within, you sort of see a multicolor diagram there. It's very interesting. You think of the United Kingdom as one entity. We actually have 4 nations within there, and it's important that we look after the individual interests of the nations. There's been a devolution of powers, and the connectivity issues in Scotland and Northern Ireland, the green portion, are quite different than they might be in the blue portion of the UK. So there's some interesting aspects to what we deal with there. What we're seeing then is a lot of increase in the diversity of demand. So private networks, transport networks, suburban connected homes, smart cities, big stadiums, lots of drone stuff. We released a drone license product. And so we're trying to look at how do we increase the supply diversity on the spectrum side. Work on Wi-Fi, public 5G. There is on and off interest in neutral hosts. We're not sure whether they're going to take off, but there are a lot of buildings in London where there are successful neutral host implementations. There's a neutral host implementation in the Tube, and there's definite interest from a number of suppliers in doing things. Progress on satellite, and a mix of both tactical FWA, where MNOs are using their spectrum tactically to generate extra revenue where they've got excess spectrum, as well as certain parts where it is the right way to serve users long term. What we see is mobile broadband continues to grow. This is a bit of an eye candy chart, but it's a bit of a lead into something out. But uncertainty on rate and location. So the first chart shows effectively our UK traffic in petabytes per month, continues to show ongoing growth. It shows the sources. A lot of it's still 4G. The second chart is pulled from Analysis Mason. What it does show, though, is that rate of growth is decelerating considerably. And we've seen that. We recently put out a Connected Nations report from OfCom. I think our latest growth, I'm trying to remember if it was, I think it was around 15% for the last quarter, off of 25. It's not yet a full trend, but certainly the long-term trend is for that rate of growth to continue to go down. So the growth is still positive, but the rate of growth has come off. And there's a lot of discussion going on as to what traffic you should be counting in that growth. Do you count that FWA that's being put tactically on the network? It's a different quality, comes with a different revenue profile. People were talking about it yesterday. It's likely to be served by fiber in the future. How much do you factor that into your growth when you're trying to figure out what your spectrum demand is? I think the other interesting thing is when we look at the spectrum portfolio, very rarely is the spectrum portfolio of our MNOs fully deployed, even in the densest areas of the country. So it's a bit of an eye candy chart at the sort of far end, but the darker the dot, the more traffic there is per dot, and there are some orange squares. Most of the demand and the exhaust that we see is those orange squares, which effectively is, or the orange surrounded squares, and you may not be able to see it, but it's effectively downtown London, downtown Manchester, downtown Liverpool. In those areas, those networks have already been densified to a certain extent. It is still hard to build new, so you have this challenge of increased densification is still challenging because you don't want to build on historical buildings, hard to get permitting. I know you guys have similar challenges, right? At the same time, a lot of the demand is there. And so a lot of the work we've been doing is to try and figure out, is there a way to serve that demand? How do you get more supply there? And, you know, in contrast to some of the discussions sort of saying we need more high power macro, we've been trying to have discussions that say, yeah, that might buy you another 2 to 3 years if you have growth, but you're going to have to go to something else eventually. So can we look at what it means to have medium power, and does that allow you to do better coexistence? Does that increase the spectrum supply? And I think fundamentally as a regulator, we're looking at how do we increase that spectrum supply. One of the big levers is power. And so we have a lot of debate with equipment vendors and our MNO counterparts on at least studying, when we do studies, let's study various power levels because it might lead you to different conclusions and allow you to do different sharing scenarios. So it's a bit of a feed in as to why we're coming at it. It's where we look at the demand. The other interesting place where they do have real challenges is in the slightly lighter color, purple colors there, where you don't have dense networks, the density isn't as high. It is expensive to densify. And there is a real need still for spectrum below 2.5 gigahertz that gives a mixture of coverage and capacity. Even 3.5 is expensive for them to deploy in a lot of those areas, and it's challenging to get as much capacity as you might need. The other topic that we're not sure how to fix is indoor coverage and coverage maps not matching to user experience, but we don't have a lot of, we've tried to solve that. Any suggestions are welcome, but I think it's a tough problem. So I think I covered a lot of this. We do already have quite a mix of sort of wide area macro spectrum, shared spectrum, and exempt or light license spectrum in the UK in our toolkit. And part of what we're trying to do now, particularly with some of the studies, is how do we do better sharing? How do we increase the supply, perhaps through power backoffs? How do we increase the supplies through making our assumptions less conservative and taking more risk on interference? I think I saw with interest, IRA had a bunch of principles that the FCC put out around there's no such thing as an interference-free network, and I think we're moving towards that and trying to push the envelope and get people to be a bit more tolerant at the edges. So sharing native solutions are needed to maximize spectrum supply. We really, we've been pushing on this, I think, for quite a while as OfCom, just in recognition of how do we get more supply there. So flexible power to accommodate variations in demand. We can't keep allocating macro spectrum. We need to find ways. We do have a carrier who's constrained on their spectrum supply, and it has driven them to deploy smaller cells, right? So it is a lot like Preston sort of described yesterday. What's the right balance between amount of spectrum and infrastructure cost? And it's not an easy equation, right? Because if it's too expensive, it won't be deployed and people won't get service. If you make it too easy by throwing too much spectrum at it, you'll exhaust it and not be able to service in a different way. And as a regulator, it's really hard in some cases to make those calls as far in advance as we need to. Some of what we're looking for through some of the hybrid solutions we've been talking about is a way to push the regulatory decision further down the pipeline and be able to make adjustments to it more easily, rather than deciding 10 years in advance whether Wi-Fi traffic is going to get high enough or commercial mobile traffic is going to get high enough, and try and pick that winner today, rather than have some flexibility and coexistence mechanisms on the table that allow you to make that choice when the actual demand materializes, or even better, where that demand materializes. Some real world coexistence solutions driving tighter packing of users. So in our shared access framework, we've been working with some of the fixed wireless suppliers to allow them to do self-coordination. So within a particular area, one of the providers will have it, another provider will have another area. We've worked on a sandbox with them where they can come together, deploy in each other's area through coordination. We're trying to see how well that works, whether, what type of training they might need, what type of certification we might need in place so that we don't have chaos, but that allows them to make more effective use. If they're deploying an FWA application, there's lots of coexistence they can have with directional antennas. Today, we assume it's an omni and we clear everybody else out. So how do we make better use of things like that? There's been lots of discussion around sharing by design built into future equipment standards. We certainly been of the opinion that if you build stuff into the equipment, whether it's aligned framing structures, listening before talking, whether it's detection mechanisms, it's using handsets at the edge of the networks with protocols. There's lots of stuff you could do in the technology that would make products more tolerant and sharing ready and allow us to make some of those decisions later. And then the last piece is, a lot of people ask us, you know, why don't you drive forward on sharing solutions? Why aren't you going faster? And I think part of it for us is the pressure on standardized and harmonized ecosystems and getting economies of scale really hasn't gone away. We just turned off our white space implementation in the UK because we don't have a database vendor anymore. You know, and the commercial model for them wasn't there. There's lots of contributing factors. You can go through it, but definitely one of the challenges was we were off on our own. I think to the extent that something like an AFC became a standardized mechanism for doing geographic control, right? And then you had other mechanisms that were more standard for providing other types of sharing coexistence, it would go a long way to giving that regulatory flexibility and the deployment flexibility we need. I gave you the example of the 1900 megahertz band. This was a band that was defined across Europe, still didn't develop a commercial mobile ecosystem because there was too much else going on. There were other bands. It sort of was between an 1800 band and a 1900 band that were doing other things, and it just never developed. Now it's been refarmed to rail, probably a good answer, but it really helps to have that focus. I think one of the interesting things as a regulator is we go to the WRC, we've been resistant to applications sort of saying, oh, this is for cars or this is for rail. It actually is quite helpful because it does focus that ecosystem development there and ensures you have equipment and that the spectrum doesn't lie fallow. There are abuses that can happen in the standards bodies, but it is interesting that certainly as you see more of it, particularly in markets that are more medium-sized, that standardization is vital. I think the last thing I wanted to talk about this is, and we'll get into some specifics, is whether technology neutrality is as helpful as it once was. And the thing we've run into there is really around our shared access framework. We wanted to be really innovative, allow people to use whatever TDD synchronization they wanted to, but that was driving exclusion zones that were sort of 25 kilometers rather than 3 kilometers. So in our most recent consultation, we've gone down a path where we're going to assume synchronization and retain the right to go in and mandate fixes. Not mandate synchronization, you can still do what you want, but we're going to assume a 3-to-1 synchronization. That's still open for final decision, but it will allow us to pack probably 10 times as many people into a given area. And so there's this real trade-off between that wanting to be technology neutral and let people innovate, yet still wanting to use the spectrum efficiently. So we've sort of taken a middle path where we've assumed a certain sync, but we're going to retain the ability to go in and resolve interference problems for people that maybe do something different. But they can also take actions to protect their transmitters and receivers, to use clutter, to be indoors. It doesn't take away all of their flexibility. I sort of jumped ahead. Just really quick for people that don't understand, I talked about what we've learned there, but shared access is our CBRS equivalent. They're effectively technically assigned local licenses. We've done them in 4 bands. We've scaled the power level with the bands to make the coverage the same. We actually have 2 power levels, a low power level and a medium power level. The low power level allows you to deploy whatever you want within a fairly small area. So 50-meter radius, you can deploy as many stations as you want at that low power, get coverage. The medium power is a per station license, and so for each of the towers you want to put up, you put up. We've seen stuff for private networks, ports, a lot of people actually testing equipment because Europe is going down the path of making 3.8 to 4.2 a common band for this, leveraging the ecosystem that exists here to get the base equipment to deploy into that band. So that's the interesting thing, is these private network bands are working where they leverage an ecosystem from another market. If we really struggled, so on 3.8 to 4.2, it looked like we were releasing 400 megahertz. We actually only ended up with 200 megahertz that was really usable. The upper 200 megahertz was much more challenging because the number of equipment vendors was much smaller, because they couldn't build the equipment's chipsets. There was no drive for a big market. So even though it looked like we had 400, it was really 200. We have somebody with a national license using 80 megahertz of that, and we have fixed and satellite users using other parts of that. We didn't have anywhere near the supply we actually thought we had, especially with the conservative engineering rules. So we've done a review recently to try and address some of these, as well as the equipment ecosystems becoming more available. You can see where all the sites are deployed, right? So you can see a lot of, so for those of you who don't know the UK geography, all those yellow dots, that's sort of the northern part. That's rural fixed wireless outside the big cities in the north. And then a bunch of enterprise research hospital networks in the bottom. If you look, you'll have seen our license volume was way up and then went way down. I would call that more of a stabilization. We had a lot of government funding that was supporting a lot of testing, so there was sort of a big spike. Some of my counterparts would say, oh, why is it crashing? Well, it's crashing because some of those government funds ran out, but we are still seeing modest growth in these licenses. The one that's been probably the most interesting to us is the ports and all of the innovation, at least for me, in terms of the real world activity we've seen in ports. And I think I heard people talking about that for CBRS yesterday. That's been the use case that's really taken off. We hope that by increasing the supply through some of those technical changes, that we're going to see more neutral host and more factory stuff. We think some of the limitation there has been because of the supply constraint in particular areas, because a lot of those businesses are concentrated. So I've talked through most of these. Picture, right? Square area, 28 kilometer square area down to a 3 square kilometer sterilization. That's just by changing assumed synchronization and the user-led coordination, right? So much bigger sharing factor. We're taking a bit more risk on interference is the bottom line. But it is quite a dramatic impact in terms of your spectrum supply. Hybrid sharing in upper 6, I talked about this quite a bit. So unlike the US, we've done the 500 at the bottom. We didn't do the upper 6. We were part of the healthy debate at the WRC. Our aim is to get the best benefit. We see validity in the claims of demand from both sides. We don't know how it's going to pan out. We don't know who needs more or less. We do think there's stuff you can do in the tech to make them compatible. So we've been trying to encourage the industry to do that. And in fact, if you look around Europe, it's quite true. A lot of the smaller countries don't see a big demand for new commercial macros. They'd rather release it as unlicensed across the band. The big cities like London, Paris, Frankfurt, other Berlin, really dense ones go, yeah, outdoor in our major core, we're going to run out of capacity, and we do need something there, but we could probably do indoor-outdoor sharing. So how do we enable that? And also the thing that I think gets forgotten is similar to the US. There are incumbents in the band. So we do have satellite earth stations for embassies, for other purposes. And we have fixed links that, for instance, are used by high-speed traders in London that sterilize a good part of the eastern portion of London. And unless we find a way to move them, and we've pretty much in the UK shut every other fixed band below 10 gigahertz that doesn't have some rain fade effects. And we moved everybody over the last 20 years into upper 6. So for those who really need a fixed link that's not got a big rain fade challenge, this is the one place we've chosen to put them. So there's a lot of reasons why we've tried to encourage can we do something that gives flexibility? There was a workshop on Monday. Some of you may have seen, and some of the results from that should be coming out soon. There should be a paper summarizing more of this. You know, obviously there's an opportunity to do this framework, but the challenge is needs a lot of cooperation, needs a lot of change in mindset. I think part of the reason we've invested in this too is ultimately a lot of the hardware for upper sixes may be locked in, and that's one of the big back pressures we get. But we do think as we talk about other bands, this type of approach is something you're going to need, because who knows where the future demand is going to be for either of the technologies. So can we do something that doesn't repeat this, say, for 6G and Wi-Fi 8 and 9, let's say? So I'm going to watch my time. A little bit more detail, you can look at that. Some pictures, you know, that sort of describe how we could split, right? We don't really know how we split. And the really interesting thing, I think other people at the conference have talked about it. We did some of our own measurements. Modern building, you lose 20 dB at the glass, right? Trying to drive high power 6 gigahertz in through the window into the middle of the buildings, probably not the best way to try and address those users, right? So use it to deliver a capacity layer. It's not the first layer in your network. There's 6 other layers there. Use it to deliver a capacity layer outside, high value, reuse it inside, you've increased the spectrum supply. You know, that's sort of the simple form of the message. It gets a lot more complicated. The other thing we've done a fair bit on is some spectrum sandboxes. We've worked with the government department, particularly around how do you use real world measurements, how do you use new authorization techniques, how do you use simulation to better understand real world risk that we could take. So we've got some projects running right now, particularly in the upper 6, around mechanisms we could use to implement some of this hybrid sharing through some sandbox funding from our government. Last bit, sharing lots of solutions, lots of execution challenges. When this was put together, they hadn't put sensing, listen before talk, and Wi-Fi at the top. I purposely moved them to the top because actually they're a great example of stuff that works really well today and meets a lot of the success characteristics on the other side, right? So it needs to be simple to implement and operate. One of the big things is you need to have certainty. So you need to have a base level of spectrum that you can be confident. I think you've seen that from CBRS. That was one of the big downfalls of white space. And you need to have security of tenure. When we go to our MNOs and we ask them about sharing with defense, the thing that continually causes it to break down is defense saying we need to be able to come and reclaim it whenever we want. And the MNO saying, yeah, that doesn't really do it. We're happy to take it 18 hours a day and give you a defined 8-hour window every day. You can do whatever we want. That's actually usable for us. But if it's an arbitrary immediate loss, it's very hard to engineer around. Now, I'm hopeful that as they need more capacity, maybe there's a happy ground. It's not the only layer in their network. They should be able to use it as a capacity layer. But that arbitrary loss makes it very hard for them to capacity engineer the network. And in some ways they go, I'll take my complexity elsewhere. And that's not meant, the defense reasons for wanting it are entirely valid. Don't take that as me questioning whether those are valid or not. It just makes the sharing challenging, right? They really want that security of tenure in terms of time. It doesn't have to be all the time, but they have to have some predictability around it. Geographic granularity, rural versus urban is very different, right? Support deferred decision making, I talked about this, flexible to changing demands, spectrum efficiency. And then there's got to be an acceptable commercial model. I'm interested to see as the AFC market matures over the next few years how that, how sustainable and how, there's certainly enough demand, but how sustainable, and people talked about it yesterday, without an AFC, the AFC solutions took 3 years longer to come to market than the base level capability. So lots of upcoming challenges and opportunities, WRC bands, direct-to-device and mobile and MSS spectrum, right? Starting to see MSS vendors trying to figure out if they can share spectrum a little bit better, more than just cellular reuse or smaller cells. One of the things we'd love to understand is how do we determine spectrum capacity and allocate to use? NGSO constellations, more MSS, the needs for private networks. What metrics should you be using to evaluate spectrum efficiency and spectrum utility? A lot of these services are really important, but how do you say how much spectrum you should have for a particular application or another one? At what level should you set the power to allow you to reuse the spectrum? Those metrics have been tough. I think I was reading some studies recently saying this is a problem we've worked on for 70 years, and I think we're just scratching the surface. I think as it gets more crowded, we're going to need to do more. And then indoor connectivity is the other big thing we see. Anyway, so welcome the opportunity to work together with everyone, and hope that was a quick whistle stop of some of our work. I gotta take questions too, I guess, right? Sorry.
Well, maybe fit in just for a question.
Sorry, I did run.
No, absolutely. Thank you, David. Yeah, there's one right over here.
Sorry, just conscious of your time.
We're good.
We appreciate it, but we'll put you on the spot anyway.
Great talk, thank you. My name is John Moran from University of Nebraska-Lincoln. In Nebraska, we have more cow and corn plants than people in the state. And rural and agricultural connectivity is a significant challenge. You mentioned you're prioritizing geographical coverage over population-based coverage. So my question is, how does it help, if any, in terms of agricultural and rural connectivity having geographical coverage? And my second question is, when I talk to farmers and when they learn what I'm doing, they ask me, why did you turn off 2G? Because I had great service. So the second question is, what are the challenges in keeping up with the generations in terms of keeping up geographical coverage from 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G?
Yeah, very good questions. Yeah, so we've just gone through a 3G shutoff, and of course what that means is we've had holes show up in places where there were not holes before. So in very valid challenge, we haven't shut 2G off yet. So it's coming, but there are good reasons that it was sustained. I don't think it's so much that we prioritize geographic coverage over populations coverage. It's just we've moved beyond. Like population coverage wasn't as complicated because of the layout of the country, and they've moved to geographic coverage. I think the challenge there is how much capacity do you have in that geographic coverage? Somewhat like the device-to-device discussion, right? What's the quality of service you're going to get? You can get a basic service, but as a regulator, we are getting pressure now from our government counterparts around defining an escalating scale of service for those, quality of service for those coverage requirements, right? Because right now I think it's 2 megabits for a handful of users, right? So it's not, it's a very basic coverage requirement, not a particularly usable one. The thing you might be interested in is if you look up Dorset, they're doing some really interesting things with millimeter wave actually for agriculture on farms, right? So there's some interesting research going on at the other end.
David, I wonder if you could explain the little teaser I did at the beginning on the lack of exclusive spectrum.
Oh, sure.
How it's used in the local access licensing.
Yeah, so none of our, although we grant a grant with protection of your use, none of the licenses are exclusive. So if somebody isn't using spectrum in a particular area, we can go in and effectively offer another license, a secondary license effectively, or negotiate with them. And so in our shared licensing framework, we also have a local licensing framework where any of the bands the MNOs have, and Canada's done something similar now, where any of the bands the MNOs have, if in rural, they're not being, for instance, they're not being used, we can write a license for somebody, we'll consult with the M&O, we'll write a license for that spectrum and allow them to use that license in that area. We also have a consultation out right now around 28 gigahertz. We have effectively block licensed fixed licenses. Some of our M&Os were maybe not being as cooperative in coordinating with satellite gateway stations, and we've proposed mechanisms for licensing effectively over the top to allow those satellite gateway stations to go in, because those licenses are not exclusive, as Simon said.
Let's see if we can squeeze in one more question.
I've got the mic, so sorry, everyone.
And you didn't jump today.
Got to move fast.
He jumped today a little bit, you see?
Good morning. I'm Scott Fox with the U.S. DoD Future G. So our focus is applying commercial technology to benefit our warfighters. It was a really interesting and very informative presentation this morning. I wondered if you could comment on your thoughts about both your current enforcement group and your future plans. You know, with these changes underway, it's not obvious to me how you look at enforcement, how robust that capability is, or how it might change as you envision a changing, more dramatic future.
So we divided up into 5 regions. So we have effectively we have a centralized monitoring center that does a lot of the HF monitoring and a bunch of other channels, a bunch of support to airports and other stuff. We then have a distributed regional field staff in 5 areas, and then an enforcement layer or compliance layer that backs that up. Our compliance officers are actually fully certified inspectors, so actually have police powers. So we actually do method of entry. So we'll bring the police along for security. So we can't do the security stuff, but if we have a spectrum case, like a pirate radio, we do the method of entry, we break the door down, we collect the evidence, we bag it, we do the whole process. So it's a bit of a different, yeah, I know, it's things they didn't tell you when you took the job, right? Before you took the job. But you know, and so we have sort of that layered ability to go out and do that. Right now, I think what we would see is we do a mix of what we call reactive cases where we get called out, and proactive cases where we go out. And right now, it's about 1 to 3. So we have room for the reactive cases to go up, and we would just do slightly less of the license auditing and some of that other stuff. So we try and use that to help balance our capacity. And what we're hoping is to sort of, similar to what I've heard CBRS guys, do this stuff gradually so that you learn as you go along and maybe raise the education level. Ideally, we talked about options about whether we should have what we call as certified users, so that we would run a certification program and allow these users to come in. And it was an idea, we haven't consulted or anything, but it was to try and understand, could you give more self-coordination ability out to the people who are deploying the networks to deploy them more effectively. We don't think we're there yet, but.
We do need to move on, unfortunately. Thank you so much, David.
Oh.